Kathy Gyngell is going to speak, and I'll introduce her more fully, but suffice to say she's been a friend of recovery for as long as I've known her, and for a long time before that, and she talked about recovery and advocated for recovery in a policy context and at a national level when it wasn't always safe to do so. She's been called some names in the past for, I think one of them was the new abstentionists and various other things, but actually I know the person behind the persona, and that's why we invited her to speak, because she's got something to say. She's been saying it for some time, and actually I think it's a privilege for me anyway to have her and Mark here and some of you that have spoken, because we're getting a real treat today. If this was a national conference, people would not feel out of place having these two here. So I think we're very prepared. I've been with Kathy in some situations where we've been in situations that are heavy duty in terms of social standing, let me say. I remember once we went to the Centre for Policy Studies. It was I got invited there for a Christmas do with the staff. So I got to Hounslow West station. I had a choice between taking my sort of ski jacket or my suit jacket, and I thought, it looks like a bit of a rainy night. I'll take my ski jacket, it looks a bit scruffy. It's just a do with the staff at the Centre for Policy Studies, on Tufton Street in central London. So I go in, and I bought, a bottle of wine and a thing of celebrations. I wasn't going to drink the wine, but I thought it's a kind of cheese and wine affair probably, so I didn't know what to bring, so I took it. And then I got really self-conscious because all these people in there, like sort of important people. I've seen that bloke on the telly. You see it on Question Time, on all that. So I went outside, and I think I might have still smoked at the time, and I rang Shelley up, I rang my wife, and I said, I'm having this fag, and there's all these people in there. There's like, I don't know, one of the Saatchi brothers, and this, that, and the other. I'm standing there, and while I'm talking to Shelley on the phone, this guy rolls up in a Maybach, and Maybach's quite a big, expensive car, and the driver comes out, goes around, opens the door, holds the umbrella. The guy's on the phone, and he's talking on the phone, and the guy's standing there with the umbrella. It's pouring down with rain. I'm just like having a sort of quick fag, and he comes out and walks to the door. As he walks past me, he says, "All right, I say," and he goes into the Centre for Policy Studies. It was John Nash. And we get into, he's Lord John Nash now, and he's Minister for Education, I think. We go in there, there's all these important people, and Kathy just goes, saying, "Come here, you need to talk to him, he's an expert in his field," blah, blah, blah. And all these important people suddenly go, "Right, okay, Kathy, right, what have you got to say then?" And she is the kind of biggest mover and shaker that I know, but it's wrapped up in a kind of almost a frail exterior that she portrays, but she's a tough lady. And she's a very knowledgeable lady. She is probably one of the cleverest people I know. And today I think she's going to try and get across to us, really, something of the history of drug use and recovery in this country.
Huseyin, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you all for inviting me too. It's always sort of really heartwarming, and I have to say, I wasn't going to talk anything personal today because most of my stories aren't really mine. They're other members of my family, but just seeing your film about Gyngell, I actually found rather moving. It took me back to my first visits when members of my family were in a similar rehab called Farm Place, and that was about 30 years ago now. And that was the beginning of my own sort of journey or relationship with and interest in addiction, recovery, policy. What I found astonishing, and I keep finding it astonishing, and it's really what I'm trying to set out to explain today. You take a look at that film, and you look at that, and you say, why, in all the billions of pounds the government spent on drug treatment, and certainly in the last 13 years, wouldn't they have been backing this? Why wouldn't this be the default? Maybe for fewer people, but not every addict at every minute wants to go into that type of treatment. What other explanation is required for the efficacy, for the meaning of that approach to humanity and helping humanity? To me, I spent the whole time I've worked in this field, especially since doing the work I did for Ian Duncan Smith, in a total state of sort of frustration that people in the Department of Health would ask for an evidence base. What other evidence base do they want than that? And actually, made that film, what, last year? Or that was my experience at Farm Place 30 years ago. You know, I'm not going to be negative. I could say, when will we learn? I think we are, and thanks to people like Mark, definitely thanks to people like Huseyin, there is the beginning of a change of climate. But that is because, in my view, government is important. We have to influence government. The only way government is influenced is from the bottom up, from people like you. Voluntary action, voluntary behaviour is the engine for change. I have given up trying to do any of the things Huseyin said I did, was to go and try and bend politicians' ears. It's no good. It's deeper than that. They will, in the end, politicians are sort of tarts, aren't they? You know, they will respond to what people know and want. And once people begin to really communicate that loud and clear, that's when you begin to get a shift, gradual shift. It's a brief history of addiction and treatment, and why we should never expect too much from government. I think the lesson I've learned more than anything, and now what I do, I'm working with 2 charities, because actually I think my time is better spent helping people and individuals than it is trying to make politicians see sense. The problem is, as you know, we all know this, the general public don't understand addiction very well. Medics don't understand addiction, and the government doesn't. And this is how it's been for the last 100 years, so, which is why these self-generating recovery movements are so important. And Mark is probably going to sit and say, who's she talking? I probably wasn't as sympathetic as I should have been to you with your recovery-oriented integrated system, but you're right. You had to operate within the system. You have to do what you can, and you've done it. Why isn't there, though, a better understanding? Why are people like Mark and Huseyin really still having trouble getting the message across? I have got a theory about this, which you may or may not agree with, but I think for over 100 years now, our problem's been exacerbated by a sort of misconceived medical response to addiction. It's my contention that the medicalisation of addiction, over 100 years now, this really began about it's not over 100 years, about coming up for 100 years, which actually extraordinarily, you know, sort of 90 years on, was taken to whole new levels by the Labour government of medicalising it, is actually more than attempts to restrict and prohibit drugs, the reason why there is still such a misunderstanding about it and why we haven't progressed as far as we should have done. The fact is, drug use and addiction, we know, have been around forever, and society has tried to grapple with them for a long time, and well before there are any laws prohibiting drugs, society was grappling with them. It didn't make the problem any less because there were prohibitive drugs, you know, 150 years ago. In fact, and this brings me to my other thing, we do have a problem in this country with an obsession with opiates, and that's been quite a stumbling block. But opiates were the first drugs to be used recreationally on a wide scale, right back in the 18th and 19th centuries. They were the first to be outlawed, and it was the first substance addiction to be treated. And I think this is sort of quite significant in the way we've come to see addiction, not the sort of descriptions we had up there that we all know. It can be any drug, anywhere, anytime. It's a behaviour. It's not the fault of the substance out there. You can't blame the substance. It's okay, it does things to the brain, but it's a behaviour. The first country to experience a huge epidemic, beyond anything we know now, in drug use was China. By the turn of the 19th, 20th century, before the First World War, the consumption of opiates in China alone was more than 3,000 tons in morphine equivalent. That is far, far, far in excess of global consumption today. Although global consumption soared again in about the, I think, 70s, 80s, from about 5 tons to 39, 40 tonnes in 2007. This is still extraordinary, far less than what the world witnessed over 100 years ago. Opium smoking spread really rapidly in the 18th and 19th centuries in China, in no small part due to an incredibly profitable opium trade driven by the wonderful Brits. They brought opium from India to China, and it was a legitimate trade, but it was not a moral one. And anyone who's read anything about the Opium Wars and China's attempts to stop this happening should know it wasn't the finest hour in British history. The traders, of course, they did what they do today. They gave the uninitiated free opium first, and when people got hooked, then they made them pay. It was extraordinary how drug abuse spread like wildfire. More and more ordinary people in China got caught up. And that's when there was an awareness of the sort of, again, like the description you just heard now, of the wretchedness, the misery associated with addiction and the personal sort of despair. It was actually no wonder that 2 Chinese emperors in the 19th century issued edicts outlawing it, because that's the obvious response. This is terrible, it's killing our society, we've got to stop it. One actually wrote how the economics of addiction set in motion a downward spiral. He said it saps the user, his family, and the community of his wealth. It's a description. It's 150 years ago he said this, and it absolutely resonates today. He knew how destructive it was. He said, when the habit becomes established by frequent repetition, it gains an entire ascendance, and the consumer of opium is not only unable to forbear from its daily use, but on passing the accustomed hour, cannot refrain from tears or command himself to any degree. I mean, he had it in one. He actually understood what was happening. But his attempt to stop this led to a war with Britain. I mean, the British did not like it. They were making plenty of money out of this. And Brits forced very unequal treaties on the Chinese. And of course, as I said, that's where the problem of addiction first became evident. But it was only when the epidemic spread to America that governments nationally and internationally took action. The UK's experiment of drugs also traces back along, opiates traces back a long way to the end of the 18th century, a little bit different. It was very much found amongst British upper classes, poets and writers, and they used laudanum to self-medicate, and they used it for recreation, and they weren't initially aware of the dangers. And I don't know how much, and probably lots of you know this, but opium is said to have inspired some of our most famous poets then. There's a very famous poem called Kubla Khan, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran, through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. It's a sort of fantasy poem that is said to have been inspired by opium. But Coleridge sort of ruled the day, really. They were all on patent medicines made from opium, cocaine, alcohol. They were all freely available. They were unregulated, unlicensed, used to treat everything from diabetes to syphilis to constipation. And of course the withdrawal symptoms were mistaken for the disease. Oh, I better have more. So they're sort of interesting parallels. Coleridge actually began using opium to relieve his rheumatism. And as he got addicted, he thought it was wonderful, and he thought it made his body harmonise with his soul. But later, he realised it was actually going to kill him. But it was really interesting how powerful it was. When Coleridge began to deteriorate, it didn't stop his sort of pals from recognising what was happening. And you've probably heard of the most famous opium addict of all, called Thomas de Quincey, and he wrote this book called Confessions of an English Opium Eater. And he used the typical junkie's logic that he was in control of the drug. Of course he wasn't. He was enslaved by it. But as I say, people didn't understand addiction. Yet there was a shift, because as upper classes sort of got away with it, when the thing drifted through to poorer people, the situation was more obviously miserable. And so by mid-19th century, America was described by some commentators as a dope fiend's paradise. And in Charles Dickens' last novel, I don't know whether any of you have come across it, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, the first the book opens with this sort of menacing Jasper, a man who Dickens makes clear later in his novel has lost his moral compass from drug use, and the description of him in leaving this awful opium den in London. And it's a chilling description. You know, again, it's interesting. This was written years before there was any prohibition, any control, but people did see there was a concern about in a way, the evil it generated. There's no doubt at all that this level of awareness and the rise of addiction, the rise of drug use then, this first epidemic, prompted a public response. And it prompted physicians to realise there was some sort of illness involved that needed treating. And it was the start of addiction becoming an expanding area of medical expertise. It also meant that politicians thought they'd got to begin to control all this freely available stuff out there being sold by quacks, whoever. And the first International Opium Commission was convened in Shanghai in 1909, and that laid the foundation for sort of better or worse, depending on your view, for our current international drug control system. In the USA, the Harrison Act was passed in 1914. That limited the use of opiates and other addictive drugs to medical purposes. It aimed to suppress drug use and addiction. And in the UK, in 1920, they passed something called the Dangerous Drugs Act, which limited production, import, export, sale, distribution of opium, cocaine, morphine, or heroin to licensed persons. But they didn't really get the addiction problem because UK very firmly took the decision to medicalise heroin addiction. And this is my own theory. This is where our problems started. We've never really, that's dominated official thinking and medical thinking since then, and it started a century of flawed medical thinking about addiction. And in some ways, it's quite funny, if you look at what was written in that 1926 guidelines on who's allowed to have heroin or not, which doctors are allowed to prescribe it for what, it reads much the same as Professor Strang's. I don't know whether you know, but the Department of Health has spent quite a lot of money trialling heroin prescribing because they say methadone doesn't work, so if methadone doesn't work, we'll give people pure diamorphine. And it's just sort of, you know, it's this curious logic of giving alcohol to alcoholics. Nobody really sort of questions it, but it's strange. But if you look back to 1926, they had the same sort of like fantasies about controlling drug use. You're going to be allowed to, legitimate medical treatment was for people who are undergoing a treatment or cure of addiction by a gradual reduction method. That was the only good thing there, and we never hear that said now. Then the second lot were persons for whom, after every effort has been made for the cure of addiction, there were no efforts for the cure of addiction, as there are now. Same thing written into the riot things. Hardly any of those chaps on the riot experiments have been into a rehab like Gyngell. I'd be interested to know if any people have failed at Gyngell have ended up on the randomised heroin prescribing trials. I bet they haven't. Then another category of people, where the complete withdrawal process produces serious symptoms which cannot satisfactorily be treated under ordinary conditions, da-di-da-di-da. A patient who, while capable of leading a useful and fairly normal life, so long as he takes a certain non-progressive quantity, usually small, of the drug of addiction, ceases to be able to do so when the regular allowance is withdrawn. I don't know, there are still people, you will see them on nose, I don't know what Mark thinks, that say they can live a perfectly normal life if they're given a dose of heroin by a doctor when they want. On the randomised controlled trials, they're getting 2, I've forgotten the dosage, heavy doses, injected doses a day, plus a methadone supplement at night. The majority of them stayed street, crack and alcohol dependent. I don't know, I think the numbers who managed just on the prescribed doses as a minority, and anyway, how could they lead a normal life? They were going into the centre to have their injections twice a day. It doesn't really fit with going out to work, does it? I mean, but what's extraordinary, these same fantasies are still there in the Department of Health. But anyway, people like you will change this. I certainly haven't had that much luck, I have to say, but anyway, there we go. Now, this system system sort of worked. It was called the British system. It sort of worked in the first half of this, well, between then and just after the war, I suppose because actually heroin use wasn't that widespread. Maybe it was a war, I don't know enough about this, but drug use was not the biggest problem. There was probably alcoholism in that period. The 60s changed all that. The whole cultural change of the 60s, and you got the start of a new drug culture, drug epidemic happening here in the West, which we're still in, effectively. And this tested the heroin prescribing system to breaking point. And some of you will know about this. It cracked under the strain. Harley Street doctors were pressured and corrupted into overprescribing. London became a hub of drug tourism. It created a bigger illicit market, bigger opportunity for crime, and really the start of a drug culture, you could say, the legacy of which is the 300,000 odd heroin and crack cocaine addicts that are still meant to be, never quite sure about these stats, in the UK today. That led Harold Wilson's government to introduce another Dangerous Drugs Use Act, which required heroin addicts to be registered at the Home Office. It was followed by a new Misuse of Drugs Act, that's the basis of our legislation today, which classified drugs into their schedules of harm. Again, in a way indicating a fundamental lack of understanding about addiction. Because we all know it doesn't make any, well it does, but it doesn't make any difference what the drug is. The idea, of course they do have inherent harms, but that isn't the inherent harm. The inherent harm is the addiction. The medicalisation of addiction was never challenged or questioned. In fact, the reverse, as drug use went up and there was obvious waves of heroin use going through different towns in Britain, the response was sort of street drug clinics and a lot of pressure on hospitals to begin to proper drug services. Doctors, if any of you read, there's volumes 1 and 2 of, what's that one, heroin, the one John Strang and his colleagues, he's done a whole sort of set of essays tracing what's happened from the 1960s with people who are working in that era. Half the doctors were making it up as they went along, giving addicts God knows what. I mean, prescribing benzos, methadone, nothing was really trialled or tested. And none of them seemed to recognise the comparison that it was like treating alcoholics with alcohol. This is another extraordinary thing. These are trained doctors, they're meant to be intelligent, they didn't sort of ask the obvious question. Equally, despite the arrival of Alcoholics Anonymous came from the USA to Britain in the 1950s. Narcotics Anonymous didn't arrive here till the 1970s. 1970s also saw the first abstinence-based rehabs from America setting up here. I think Phoenix House was one of the first, and a sort of cottage industry taking off. But despite that, again, this did not influence government and national health policy. It was sort of to one side of it. And from that point on, really from the 70s, 80s, you went into treatment in the 86. There was been an uneasy relationship between that sort of self-generating cottage industry, charitable, faith-based, like Yeldall Manor, some private approach, what I think is the right approach to treatment and addiction and support. I mean, you can't help but think this is the right one when you've experienced it with members of your own family, and it carries on being confirmed by everybody you meet. There was this uneasy relationship between that and the much larger National Health Drug Services system. Now, the National Health were, you know, to be sort of fair, it took some persuading to make the National Health treat addiction and not stigmatise drug use anymore, and but the problem in doing that, they defined it as a chronically relapsing disease, something to be managed, not to be cured. This has really been a disaster. Well, I think it's been a disaster. And the NHS has still not really been happy about spending drug treatment money on abstinence and rehab programmes. Based on the grounds that they need evidence-based treatment. That means randomised control trials that give you evidence of something but not of recovery.
And recovery innovators have had to operate around the system to some extent, despite the new drugs policy, still are. I think the other thing they haven't really understood that comes across so sort of loud and clear from the stories on the Gyngell Manor thing is that actually people do stop taking drugs and being addicted when they take a decision to do it. And it's for the same reasons that motivate all our actions, like having a baby, like recognising you do have family responsibilities, literally becoming sick to death of that lifestyle. And the National Health Service response and the government policy response has never been to maximise on that, though I think we are seeing signs of some change now. They've been much more preoccupied by public health issues like AIDS, like needles, and they've concentrated energies on public health campaigns. And I think, again, that's okay, it's good, it's essential, but it sort of misses part of the picture. I mean, when I did research, I began doing research for Ian Duncan Smith desktop research, and the NTA at that point, National Treatment Agency, was collecting brilliant statistics, and it showed how people were referred into treatment, and they were publishing this annually. Nobody was referred from a needle exchange. In fact, 40% of the people consistently were self-referring. So if you self-refer yourself to treatment, it means you actually want to get better, one would assume. And so two things were ignored. One, that there were windows. The whole idea about expanding drug treatment services under Labour was to reach people, not to stigmatise them and introduce them into treatment. But what do? They don't introduce, they reach them, but don't introduce them to treatment. They maintain their addiction. And that's when I sort of came across the whole horror of realising how many people were parked on methadone. And I was very shocked because I knew my own family that hadn't had to happen to them. They were lucky. They'd got to a Gyngell Manor. They'd got to Wendy's wonderful rehab. They'd had that chance. They'd never been parked on methadone. Anyway, however, then you think, why don't people learn? Why don't people learn? The sort of doing this, my potted history leaping about all over the place. Under the Conservative government in the 1990s, they were aware that they needed to do more about treatment. And this government, some of you will know more about it, set up a drug treatment effectiveness review, which was a very intelligent thing to do. And what they did, they conducted a drugs treatment outcome survey, randomly assigning 700 addicts to community methadone programs or to rehabs like Gyngell. And the results were very interesting, but they were, in a way, they were spun, what you call misconceived, selectively interpreted. The results were published about the time Tony Blair and the Labour government came into power, and they were described. The conclusion that came out of this was a wonderful conclusion: treatment works. But it was an across the board. Instead of saying rehab works better, which they had in fact indeed showed, although in this wretched survey they didn't use abstinence recovery as a sort of goal outcome, it was still relative reductions in criminal behaviour or whatnot. It was, what do you call it, proxy measures. This rather wonderful survey that told us a lot and actually showed rehab had the best longest term sustained outcomes, because after all, methadone wouldn't, would it? As we all know, but that didn't quite occur to them. It was still interpreted in this very limited way, saying £3 investment in treatment will save £9 in crime and health costs. So, and this absolutely took hold, and this theme had carried on being regurgitated and spouted for really up until the last year or two ago, since the new recovery-oriented drug strategy. And really it never occurred to the general public, nor to many politicians and commentators, that treatment working didn't mean people getting better. And so I remember it took Mark Easton, you'll remember that, when he attacked poor old Paul Hayes, the head of the National Treatment Agency, saying how many people have got better. And Paul was floundering about because it was sort of less than 3% or so. I can't remember the numbers now. But for all this money and all these people being brought into treatment, because they were targeted, they had targets, they had to double the number of people in treatment, all put on methadone, who was getting better? And so there was a sort of rather public humiliation. But even after Mark Easton revealed that, it sort of went into abeyance again. That was about the time that I began working with Ian Duncan Smith on the our own drugs policy review, and that we realised how negative this heavily invested system had become. It had become a sort of bureaucratic dinosaur. And that's when I found that the nice, it's all terribly boring, so I'm sorry, it's just so that there's so many guidelines. NICE, National Institute of Clinical Excellence, set the guidelines that the NTA used for organising all its drugs action teams around the country, that methadone was made the standard frontline treatment. So people had very little room for manoeuvre if they were working within the system, even if they didn't want to give that treatment. Psychosocial work, NICE said, probably still does, it's just to be supportive of prescribing, not an alternative to it. You know, and they continued to ignore, as Huseyin said, when I began talking about abstinence, people treated me as I was like some Mary Whitehouse character. You know, that it was, I was some sort of Puritan. But that wasn't about Puritanism. It was, you know, when he said the neo-abstentionism, that was about what works. So it was sort of quite a difficult, and I used to get so cross, I'm probably by far the least best communicator. I didn't spend my time really trying to introduce people like Huseyin, who are much better advocates and were living, you know, advocates of what worked. For it, I'll whiz on. Anyway, we wrote our very critical reports back, when did we write them? 2006-07. And as I said, for our pains, it was a huge amount of hostility that I wasn't sort of expecting. I mean, I remember there was something called a charity information service called the United Kingdom, I can't remember, a drugs group think tank. And that's right, and they called us in. They wrote, oh no, that's right, they wrote the most abusive and hostile response to the reports. And in the reports, I'd interviewed so many people, we visited so many rehabs, we had so many voices speaking. I couldn't believe that anyone could be hostile, because I tried to sort of really, I wouldn't say lace the report, but to show this wasn't me. The report was the channel for people in recovery to speak, and we called it Towards Recovery. And they went up on their website, I can't even remember what they said, but their language was awful about it was sort of, you know, not scientific, but it was worse than that. So I said, I'd like to come and see you, I'm horrified that you write. So I went in to see Professor Strang, Dame Ruth Runciman, Roger Howard, and Dame Ruth Runciman was perhaps ashamed. She said, I can't believe you're undoing all the good work we have been doing ever since we did our 1988 declamation from the whatever, putting public health first. And I said, I'm not undermining public health. I'm saying people can get better. So it was a sort of really interesting process. But although we didn't start a change then in policy attitudes, there is no doubt that the fact that we withstood this, and there were enough other people out there lobbying, when the coalition got into power, they did introduce a new drug strategy. And Husein's told me to be positive. So I'm going to be positive, and I was thinking about this, and it is indeed positive if you look back at it in terms of the 100-year history. The title of this, the 2010 drug strategy, it was markedly different to anything that's gone before. It included in its subtitle, Building Recovery, Supporting People to Live a Drug-Free Life. And I remember David Burrows, MP, who, you know, I worked quite closely with. He said to me, Kathy, stop being so negative. You don't realise this is significant. And I said, well, what's inside it? Where's the money for rehab? Where's this? Where's that? Why didn't you let me come along and see this before it was published, David? I was so mean to him. I feel awful now because he was right. Because I think just even having the term recovery in the title of a government document has begun to make a significant cultural shift. And, you know, it's a shift people like Mark have been working on within the system, haven't you, for a long time. And I know it's not ideal what's happening with public health. England taking it over, I am not au fait with all of that. I don't know whether it's good, bad or ugly. But the point is, a lot of what happens with changes, it's the unintended rather than the planned outcomes that are the most important. And I think it's two things. There's no doubt recovery movements even though the government's still spending money on giving people methadone, there are more recovery movements around this country than ever in its history. And you hear about recovery movements in a way, what, 5 years ago? You just didn't. So I want to end, and I think the next thing is, and I'm hearing this fed back to me from person after person who runs a rehab, that although they're still finding it difficult to get people money to pay for referrals, they are finding different attitudes amongst the commissioners, and there isn't such negativity towards abstinence. There's a better understanding of it. So on this positive note, I just want to end with a quick story about the most recent rehab. It's been around a long time, but I hadn't met them before, and they're called Street Scene, and some of you may know them. And I think it's a wonderful example of voluntary action and how that action itself shifts sort of public opinion, government opinion, then comes back and they can take advantage of it. So they certainly, when I spoke to them on the phone yesterday, they are clear that the stigma against abstinence is being won, because there has been a stigma against abstinence. They think there are more people in the system who are mindful of what's involved and needed for the process of recovery, and more commissioners are employing people who have been in recovery. Anyway, their story of hope and cheer is this. And they've given me permission to share it with you. It was started by one woman getting clean in 1998 because she had a baby, and she thought she'd better clean up her act. And which is exactly, of course, what does happen in real life. 1 year later, she converts an old hotel into a rehab, and she helped by many other of her mates in recovery. 2 years later, she opens it, and it provides beds for 10 clients. 4 years later, she gets lottery money funding and finds another property. A year later, that opens, allowing Street Scene to now house 26 clients. 2 years later, in 1998, they're approached by another charity to open up in another town. In 2000, that house opens up in the town, and Street Scene overall is now taking 44 clients. In 2001, she acquires more flats for a resettlement programme, bringing the number of overall places to 72. Another 10 beds are added in 2006. Today, 2013, they tell me they have more aggressively marketed themselves in the last 3 years than in any time before. They are full. They have been consistently full. They're working with a number of sympathetic and supportive commissioners from London around the country who are getting referrals to them and filling their beds, and who more and more understand that actually for recovery to work, rehab as well as day programmes, residential rehab really is essential, just again as the film showed. Anyway, they sold their message of hope, and for me, this is the lesson for all of us. It's an example of voluntary action being the engine for change, and eventually government catches up. And that, I think, you're the people who do it. So you're fighting a great cause just by being there, being interested, sharing your stories and your honesty fundamentally. Thank you.